This is Jonathan Yates with Wine Channel Television. Welcome to Capitol Hill for another episode of the Bipartisan Appeal of Wine. With us this time is Representative Jeff Fortenberry from Nebraska. Representative, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Pleasure to be with you. This is a little different type of interview for me.
How's that, sir?
Well, talking about wine in this artisanal space that's being carved out in terms of our economic production, agricultural production in Nebraska, it's different for me and it's exciting, so pleasure to talk to you.
Well, you know, it's interesting. In a previous episode of my show, I had a congressman from California, and he was talking about what a great time he had visiting the wineries in Nebraska. Does that surprise you?
And I'm surprised he didn't call me. And I'm very
You're
upset about this.
disappointed.
He didn't even ask for a visa. Usually we give these guys from California visas, but there's a little secret expression we have among viticulturalists in Nebraska too. Any, he said, fool can grow grapes in Napa, but takes a real vintner to grow them in Nebraska.
Well, you're winning the awards, so something is definitely working at the Nebraska wineries.
Well, we've got 35 wineries now and a little bit of history behind us. It's my understanding the first one was implemented 25 years ago. There used to be wild grapes on the prairie, so there's a natural environment for it. But what's also happening, interestingly, is we're a production ag state. I mean, that's the backbone of our economy. It informs our values, our rural way of life, and we're very proud of that. And yet, at the same time, many farmers and many hobbyists and others who are interested in agriculture but who will never have access to large amounts of land are carving out niche spaces and growing the ag family in fascinating ways with farm-to-table movement and artisanal agriculture and specialty products. So I, of course, include wine in that spectrum and really proud of not just the production aspect of what we're doing or the viticulturalists are doing, but also the ambiance, the environment it creates, the diversification of economies, the inviting nature of what a winery means and stands for. I think that's all very exciting, and again, it grows the ag family, and it's completely consistent with who we are in the Great Plains.
Now, wine does not grow by itself. You know, it takes a lot of help from the government with the private sector. How have you been able to help the wine industry in Nebraska? What is the state and the federal government doing to help?
Well, first of all, these are entrepreneurs who take risk. This is not a government project. These are entrepreneurs who are taking risks because they have a love for the product, they have a desire to work the land, a lot of times with their own two hands. People who have set up interesting other economic dynamics around the wineries, such as visitor centers and tasting sites and such. So the primary credit goes to people who are taking risk and being innovative and who wanted to reestablish this dynamic on the Great Plains in Nebraska. So it's a small niche, but it's grown significantly, and there's a lot of risk there.
Well, do you see these entrepreneurs in Nebraska becoming more and more professional in the world of wine? You do have a winemaking program at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln.
Yeah, isn't that interesting and exciting?
Yes.
But again, it's part of a trend. Our ag programs in general are growing. People think of agriculture maybe as, because most people are removed from the farm now.
Right.
Very few people actually grow the vast amounts of food that we have in our country anymore. So as people become more urbanized, they become more and more remote from farming. But the ag family is growing, and that's because of a convergence of a variety of things. Traditional studies like agronomy and animal science are integrating with environmental science and even international development. The wine program, as you mentioned, is another branch of this. So as young people come forward and are looking at a way to be innovative, to use their own two hands to make things, consistent with this pastoral ideal of working the land, of creating products from nature itself. This space is one that is potentially ripe for new opportunity as well, along with the other artisanal agricultural niches that we are seeing springing up throughout the state.
And how are you able to help these niches from your membership on the Agricultural Committee on Capitol Hill?
Well, you know, again, we're not in the business of direct subsidization here, but in terms of the general aspects of disease research and things, I would assume that has some input into how vineyards are able to manage their production process. Now, so there's no support program for wine. Now we have certain support programs for like corn production where you have crop insurance and other types of things where we will actually help market those products overseas and such. So the primary credit here goes to people who are actually being innovative and taking risk in a business sector that is growing, but takes a lot of hard work and innovation.
Now, newspapers have lauded your expertise on foreign affairs. Where did that come from?
Well, that's nice of you to say. It's interesting you should say this. One of my first experiences as a younger college student, I stepped foot in the Middle East in 1979, and that was the year that the peace accord was signed between Egypt and Israel.
Camp David, yes.
Camp David, brokered by the United States. And so when I entered the Sinai Desert as a young person, there was a spray-painted sign on a twisted pile of concrete and rubble, which is sadly all too familiar of a scene now in the Middle East. And this had been the place where there had been fighting in the '73 war. Egypt and Israel had fought 4 wars since the 40s. And that sign simply said this: here was the war, here is the peace. It said it in English and in Arabic. That was a formative moment for me. It stayed with me. The imaginative possibility of peace, not just being an interlude between conflict, but the deeper idea of entering into the diplomatic space so that we can build authentic relationships between nations, appreciate differences in culture so that shared and learned wisdom of the ages can actually advance human interaction and human understanding, and create the dynamics of the proper dynamics of exchange and trade, both cultural and economic, for the betterment of all peoples. This is something from my heart, and when I came to Congress, I chose to get on 2 subcommittees, Africa and the Middle East. Now, we were at the height of the Iraq War. Having lived in the Middle East, I thought I could perhaps make some contributions here because I had maybe a deeper understanding of culture and to some degree Islam. And so that's where I started in Congress. But it's a desire of the heart. I think we are in desperate need of a 21st century architecture for international relations. The world, as advanced as we've become in terms of material gain, the world is screaming for meaning.
Sure.
And that meaning is only found when people are nested within authentic community, where persons are understood, interact with others in a constructive way, protected, and loved. Now, that's a little bit of an abstract concept to bring into legislative realm, but it should provide the basis for a deeper understanding of how we actually save civilization in the 21st century. Economics alone is not going to get us there. Us outpacing our enemies through ever-advancing technological superiority, that tech gap is going to close in the next 10 to 20 years, so that anybody with a nefarious idea could have access to the smallest technology that could fly right outside the door here and take us all out. Then what? Then what do? We can't spend our way out of that. We can't build more and more technology to get us around that. We have to build the basis for better understanding, preparing people for peace, which means authentic relations. This is why I invest in this space.
Well, let's look at, you mentioned the legislative realm. Did that experience inspire you to come to work on Capitol Hill?
I think it was all part of the early formation in myself, the desire to participate in government. I've always seen public service as a noble pursuit, an honorable and high calling, as much shoving and pushing and acrimony as there is in Congress. I've always seen the law and the process of making law as a process of achieving good for the sake of justice, for the sake of human dignity. That is the basis for the law. Now, once we stray into that and get into the messiness of politics, it exhausts people, and that's unfortunate because we ought to have a deep confidence, if you will, that this process here, which can be messy, but is ultimately tethered to the deeper principles of what is higher and noble, righteous and good. When you bring this set of propositions to people, when you can speak in this language, I just had some people in my office a few minutes ago from the country of Tajikistan. Now, that's a long way from Nebraska, former country of the Soviet Union, who were quoting to me a letter that Thomas Jefferson had written to his grandson, citing Cyrus, the king of Persia's first principles of the rights of movements of people, the freedom of religion, and the right to own property, and that how Jefferson had lifted some of these concepts. So when we speak to other peoples in this kind of language, we find this common bond for all humanity, and that needs to be the basis of diplomatic relations, not who has the biggest and next oil well.
Well, what I find impressive and inspirational is that when you worked on the Hill, you still decided to run for Congress after that experience. I'm one of the few people who's willing to admit on television that I think very highly of members of Congress, and I think you guys do great work. Have you found it to be different now that you have the honorable in front of your name rather than being, another underpaid, overworked Hill staffer like I was for over a decade? And your press secretary wanted me to put that in too, so what can I say?
Well, I'm sorry about that. We'll have to review his salary. I do have the honorable as a title in front of my name, but back in Nebraska, my name is Jeff.
Yes.
And when I go to the grocery store and buy things, a lot of times I'll hear over my shoulder, "Hey, Jeff, can I talk to you about something?" I am grounded where I live.
Yes.
My family live. I have 5 daughters. We live in Nebraska. And I think that's important because however long I'm here, it's still temporary. This is going to pass. And my fundamental obligation is to pass along perhaps a contribution that I've been able to make to the well-being of Nebraska and the well-being of America. But the idea that there are institutions that have to have a continuity of presence if we're going to take the wisdom of the ages and give it to the next generation. In one generation, all of this can be gone. So yes, I was a staffer. We've got good staff up here working long hours for very low pay. We don't ask anybody to feel sorry for us in Congress. It's frankly a pretty hard job. It's very tough because you can never please everyone. Human nature is to want to try to please everyone.
Yes.
You have to get over that real fast. But you get reminded every now and then, actually you get reminded quite a lot, that this is important, that good things can happen, that the quiet aspects of what takes place, member to member, relationship to relationship, the things that never make the news that actually create good progress, it keeps you motivated and keeps you longing to stay in the arena here.
So let's talk about going back to Nebraska. In an interview, Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest men and I think the greatest investor of all time, he says he has a competitive advantage by living and working from Omaha because he said if he was working in Manhattan or some other, global financial center, his judgment and his thinking would be clouded because he would be forced to look at quarterly earnings like everybody else does who works on Wall Street. But he said when he can stay in Omaha and think, he can look at things that are important. Do you find that to be true?
It's interesting you should say this. So we had a tax law provision coming before us a few years back, and I thought to myself, I didn't know Warren Buffett, and I don't have a proximate relationship with him, but I thought, why don't I go get his opinion?
Yes.
So we just called him. He said, sure, I'd be happy to see Jeff. I sat down with him for an hour. And I was there to learn about his perspective on a subtle nuance as to why we weren't seeing more inflationary effects in international markets and such. Because the econometrics dynamics that I was thinking through would have pointed to these dynamics. Anyway, he said, tell me about your family. See, most people don't realize he grew up here in D.C. His father was a member of Congress.
He went to Wilson High School in
Northwest. Very
Northwest.
Conservative, right-wing congressman. Of course, his politics are more left. But he graciously received me and wanted to know what the dynamic was for my own family, given that he had been raised here. And then I asked him about this subtle nuance of the tax code consideration that we were undertaking. And he said, look, Jeff, he turned around to his credenza behind him. He pulled open the file. He pulls out an old, yellowed manila folder, and he pulls out a sheet of paper. He said, Jeff, this was my tax return. You want to do something big and important? Make it just a single page. That's what he said. And I think that's to your point. When you can get away from the Gnosticism of New York. Look, finance is really about three things. It's the amount of capital, time, and interest.
Sure.
And they create all of these sophisticated financial instruments in order to make it more and more removed from the average person. And so you can get caught up in those orders. We saw that in the financial crisis. Yes. In fact, I asked my own bankers one time, I said, how many of you use synthetic collateralized debt obligations? Something like that. And they all just stared at me.
Collateralized debt obligations.
Yeah, synthetic.
Yeah.
Synthetic collateralized debt obligations. I think that was the term, Wall Street term du jour. And they all just stared at me like, what? They had never even heard of the concept. And I said, good for you guys. And so that's why things didn't break in Nebraska. They broke in New York.
You think that's why Buffett invests in so many Midwestern companies?
Of course. He's grounded in a place that's truly authentic and good, where there's still the values of neighbor helping neighbor, where there's perspective that we all have a responsibility first to ourselves and our family, but also to our community. We have our stresses like anywhere else. We also live in a place that's informed by the rural character. In fact, this summer, 2 of my daughters will be doing something called detasseling. That means they'll wake up at just an awful early hour in the morning and get on a bus, half awake, go to a cornfield that is cold and wet, maybe 30 miles away, and pull tassels off the top of the corn, fighting off corn, rash, and insects until the heat of the day when you can't stand it anymore. Then they'll get back on the bus and come home for the minimalist of pay. And they do it gratefully because it gives them work, and it's this early lesson between effort and reward. And it's also an early lesson that you better study harder, you're going to keep doing that your whole life. So when young people have this kind of experience, it's these valuable life lessons that informs our culture there, and I think that's why Buffett is attracted. And by the way, when I was on the Lincoln City Council, prior to being in Congress, I was on the City Council of my hometown, Lincoln. We were declaring some area blighted for economic development purposes. And the issue came up that how we really need to be careful with this blighting tool, because Warren Buffett's own home was declared blighted in a blighted area.
Now, Senator Sassy from across the hill from Nebraska, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about how vital and character forming it was when he worked these menial, low tassel jobs growing up. Do you feel that way too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so proud of my children for not just desiring to do it, but doing it and carrying on this important Nebraska tradition. Again, it's this early lesson between effort and reward. And it's a messy job. It's pretty tough.
Now, you mentioned perspective. Now, Warren Buffett also said, if you can't think clearly in Omaha, you can't think clearly anywhere. Do you find yourself like waiting till you return to Nebraska to make the big decisions that a congressman has to make? I mean, do you find that you think clearer out there in Nebraska than you do here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, it's interesting. I do live in Nebraska, so I go back and forth most of the time. Again, my family's there. The first year I was in Congress, I had my whole family here for the entire summer. And my wife, who has been very generous and sacrificial in allowing me to pursue this while she takes care of a lot of things that I ought to be helping with, but she simply can't. When, at the end of that summer, she looked at me, she said, if you want us to live here, we'll live here. And I had made the decision that they should live in D.C. But when I got them home, they were so overjoyed to be back in Nebraska. I said, okay, I'll just go back and forth. You guys stay here. I think, of course, yes. I have come off a period of time, which I haven't had in the longest time, of a significant time back around Easter in Nebraska. And for the first time, and I can't remember when, I saw my own pear trees bloom, the magnolia bloom, the flowers start to bloom in my ryegrass, or my bluegrass and rye, turn luscious green. It was really refreshing. So the answer is a long answer, yes.
Now, speaking of those, you know, the other members of Congress I've had on the show, they talk about water as being a big issue for the wine industries in their states, particularly California. What's the water like in Nebraska? Is there an abundance? Is there drought situations like California?
It's plentiful. Now, we have gone through droughts in recent memory, particularly out west. We have, in the southwest part of the state, there's a water agreement with Kansas. We irrigate a lot, and so there has to be water management plans. And so we entered into a compact with Kansas as well. But in the eastern part of the state where we are, it's a plentiful resource. It's one of the reasons that ethanol has all the input ingredients, the alignment of the processes for ethanol really converge in Nebraska, so we have a distinct advantage in the production there. So we're number 2, right behind number 1. So that's, again, an important input. So, and the wineries are concentrated on the eastern side of the state. So.
And you think that's because of the water issue?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you could teach me that. I'm not sure. Is it part of the reason?
Oh, we think so. The wines use a tremendous amount of water, and they're very, very, very strong on the environment. Both my parents grew up on farms in the Shenandoah Valley, so I come from a long line of farmers in Virginia. And, you know, we were always taught that, you know, the land is what's most important for a farmer, and that, you know, farmers were the first environmentalists. I mean, do you have that same outlook coming from Nebraska?
Oh, absolutely. This is why yes, farmers are the first stewards of the land. No farmer wants his own land to be polluted.
No, it's your heritage.
It's your heritage, and it's also this deeper value of stewardship, and it's what you'll pass along, and it's the means of your livelihood. So sometimes we find debates about environmental protection to be unusual because we feel like we do that every day, and of course you have bad outliers, but we do that every day in a responsible manner, particularly in our agricultural sector. We can always think through innovation and modernization, and we're doing that now by different varieties and such. We've reduced input cost, inputs on the land by about 30% just in modern times, and yields have significantly increased, which causes another dilemma for farmers, and that there's huge supplies of grain and therefore lower prices. So yes, that is a consistent value, that we are first stewards of the land, and that the farmer and people involved in agriculture have a vested interest both for their own economic well-being, but this idea of carrying on this heritage of stewardship is essential to us.
So I have friends who grew up on the East Coast, and their daughter went to the University of Nebraska, and they love craft beer. And when they went to the first Nebraska football game, they were in heaven. What is the craft beer industry like in Nebraska?
Exploding. And I think this is consistent. Of course, I love craft beer too.
Yes.
And I think it's consistent with what the next generation is looking at. Look, I think.
And how so is that?
Well,
more artisanal, more boutique,
exactly.
more niche?
Okay. You know, we're on the tail end, I don't know how old you are, but with the very tail end of the baby boom generation, or proximate to it. So you remember the old idea growing up that, no, you go to work for someone, and then you stay planted there.
Sure.
And you'll receive the security of an income and the guarantee of some retirement and a gold watch. Well, that's nice, but that's over.
Yes.
Corporate America is not going to do that for people anymore.
And do you think that's good or bad for the economy?
I think it's necessary and an extraordinary dynamic of returning to an older craftsman farmer model of economic organization with modern innovation. Now, we're always going to have big business because there's certain economies of scale that are necessary for certain type of production. But when I'm meeting with the Brugger brothers, for instance, from Albion, Nebraska, right outside of my congressional district, two guys that ought to be on your show. In fact, let's tee them up.
That'd be great.
They're production ag guys, maybe third, fourth generation farmers. They're twins, but they're interested in doing the next phase agriculture by carving out little niches. They're growing hops. They're producing whiskey. I think they're interested in craft beer, as I recall correctly. But what they're doing is trying to plant that in their small town of Albion, so it becomes a Main Street dynamic, which is occurring around Nebraska. But the craft brew industry is a fascinating, innovative space for entrepreneurs that, again, touch this deeper idea of, I want to do something with my own two hands. I don't want to just turn my labor over to some large corporate bureaucracy and plug into what they're doing. I want to be responsible for my own economic well-being and be in interdependency with the customer I serve. In other words, I make the product, I sell it to you, I receive the income, you receive a value, and in that exchange, we become friends. That's the full basis of a vibrant, good, dynamic, growing, well-intended economy. We lost sight of that, and our language up here is all upside down. We talk in terms of charts and graphs, and production and inputs and labor. It's not about what's the purpose of business? Most people, any business school you go to, if you ask them, what's the purpose of business? Profits. No, it's not. It's persons.
Yes.
The purpose of business is persons. Profits are a gateway to helping persons. The person who's taking a risk, the person who receives the value of the product, the community that benefits from this interaction.
Now, you know all about the strong entrepreneurial spirit in the state of Nebraska, but did you ever think you'd see 35 wineries and booming and winning all the awards?
I think it's tremendous. It's absolutely tremendous because, look, when you cross that Missouri River and you work your way through the bottomland along that mighty river, and then you put your foot on the Great Plains and that vast expanse that's in front of you, it is some of the most amazing country in the world. And it's not well known either.
No, but
but the idea of the viticulturalist, the winemaker, having niches.
Yes, in Nebraska.
In Nebraska, in the middle of our farm country, is a part of that Great Plains mystique. The idea that there is something here rooted in the land that's important, that's permanent, that can be passed along. that reflects the value of stewardship, that creates the conditions for community. Because what does wine do?
Yes.
What does it ultimately do? Yeah, it tastes good, can taste good, but it creates the platform for community.
When you think about it, the football team should now be big red and big white to accommodate the growing wine community in the state of Nebraska.
Well, you know,
I think there's a sense of Congress resolution coming up from this.
You know, our spring game, you know, one part of the team's red, part's white.
Hey, so we're wrapping it up now. So what's your favorite Nebraska wine memory?
Well, you know, the Arbor Day Foundation and their lead lodge is in Nebraska City. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but the Arbor Day Foundation plants trees all over America and all over the world. And they're located right there in Nebraska City. So we have a number of communities across the nation. They're called Tree Cities USA. So that's what Arbor Day does. But they have a lodge attached to their facilities, and they have a magnificent selection of locally grown wines. And we were talking about St. Croix earlier.
That does lead to some great memories.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful, beautiful setting. I want you to come out. Let's do our next show there.
I look forward to it. I think it's time to court this episode of the
Thank you very much.
Bipartisan Appeal Wine. Thank you.